Welcome to our first faculty lecture. First out is Professor Cyril Havaroon, who has been with us quite a long time now, sitting in Ukraine today. So he will lecture from Ukraine. That's the mystery of the new technology. Cyril Havaroon is actually one of the most influential thinkers today, at least in Orthodoxy. He's doing kind of neo-patristic synthesis, but in a different way than was the case in the 40s and 50s. Rowski, Schmemann and their followers argued for a patristic revival with aspirations of returning back to an ancient time when the church was in the middle of a village, where it constituted a natural center or hub of information, with liturgical rituals as a breath of the local community. Cyril instead argues for a church that not only has to accept that it is not in the center of all things anymore, but even more, that it's not even desirable anymore to return to that age. And he argues in several publications and books, he argues for a church that has a different perspective, a different way of approaching the civil society. In one sense, one can say that Cyril advocates a church fully open to the civil society, even learning from a civil society. Only in that sense can the church actually contribute in itself in a dialogue with the surrounding context. Without being able to learn from outside, it cannot teach any other also. Today, he will introduce us to the field where he's part professor of. He has two fields, ecclesiology, but today he will present international relations and ecumenism. And in that field, he has a tremendous experience, both from a practical side, being the head of external relations in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate, but also sitting in the World Council of Churches, various committees, and especially Faith and Order. But also sitting almost every dialogue that the Orthodox Church has been engaged in the recent decades. His practical experience has been combined with his numerous productions in the field of international relations and ecumenism. But he started off in the very beginning as a patristic scholar when he did his doctoral work together with Professor Andrew Love. And that field also contributes to his professorship, where he has been working on the Christological conflict between the Eastern Orthodox family and the Oriental Orthodox family. I would say maybe he's one of the best in that field in the world at the moment. So we are very happy to have Professor Cyril Havaroon with us today to lecture on his field, international relations and ecumenism.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for your nice words. They give me a lot of credit, I should say. It's my honor to address the distinguished public online today. It's a pleasure to be a part of San Ignatius Stockholm School of Theology team. And actually, this invitation to lecture publicly on this subject incited me to think anew, afresh about the field. And I would like to present to you a kind of new optics, if you want, to look at the entire timeline, if you want, of the church-state relationships, particularly in the Christian East, but also in the Christian West, because the Christian East has produced models for the church-state relations in the West as well. As we recently discussed with our students in our classes, Stockholm School of Theology, and we discussed, for instance, the model of the church-state relations in Sweden, and I kind of insisted to think about this model having as their mother the relations between the church and the state in the East, primarily in Armenia. The Armenian situation was the mother of all the symphonies, of all the established churches, and then in Byzantium. So it's, yes, I'm going to surf as it were, through different models of the church-state relations from the earliest decades of Christianity through our times. And I'm also going to use this new optic that I'm suggesting to look at the international relations and ecumenism. What I'm going to present is a scheme. This will be a very schematic presentation. I would say speculative, maybe too speculative to some tastes. Nevertheless, I think and I hope that the scheme may work for you, and will explain, give a new look at the outlook at the subject that we are discussing. In this scheme, which I hope, well, which certainly will neglect some nuances and some complexities. Nevertheless, this scheme does not contradict, I believe, those nuances and complexities of the that existed in the past in the ecumenical relations and the church-state relations and so forth. So in this scheme, or the coordinate axis, if you want, like x, y, I suggest two poles or two axes. One pole is the issue or the notion, a category of political legitimacy, this one. Another axis or another pole would be this one, power sharing. So my suggestion is to use those two categories, two notions, political legitimacy and power sharing, as a methodological instrument, a method of considering the church-state relations, the international relations in which the churches are involved, and the ecumenical relations between the parts of the divided Christianity. I will start very early. I will start with the Roman Republic, or maybe even Athenian democracy. We'll go through the Roman Republic, then the Roman monarchy, which we know as empire, through the Christianized Roman Empire, which we know as Byzantium, through the successors of the Roman Empire, like the Ottoman Empire, like the Russian Empire. Then we'll go through the 20th century, through the dictatorships that occurred in the 20th century, through the clash of ideologies, primarily communist and nationalist ideologies, and through the post-Soviet era. So it will be a very wide span of time. So let me start with some preliminary notions, like what is political legitimacy? I distinguish it from legality. It's quite different, even though it sounds similar. And it has to do with the reception. Legitimacy is more about reception and appreciation of political figures by their constituencies. In ancient Greece, where this idea of legitimacy emerged, the political leaders who lacked legitimacy were called tyrants. So tyrant is a technical term from the political philosophy of antiquity, and it meant a political leader who lacked political legitimacy. Even though a tyrant was legal, he was elected legally. Since the antiquity, rulers have strived for legitimacy. They were always hungry for legitimacy, and legitimacy was always in deficit with the rulers. Even if they enjoyed, the highest degree of legitimacy, they still were hungry for it. Nowadays, legitimacy is measured by sociological polls, usually, and of course, materialized in the election results. And religion has always played a significant role in providing political legitimacies for the states and individual rulers. If we go back to the Roman Empire, or maybe to the Roman Republic before that, we can speak about Pax Deorum, the peace of gods. And the peace of gods was regarded the source of the political legitimacy for the Roman rulers. In the Roman Empire, the monarchs, the emperors, were supposed to draw their legitimacy from Pax Deorum and to translate, to transfer this Pax Deorum to the peace of their dominion, to the Pax Romana. So the job of the political rulers in the ancient world was exactly to translate Pax Deorum to Pax Romana. In a sense, and I like this comparison, we can compare this idea of securing Pax Romana through mediating with the Pax Deorum. We can compare this with the Chinese concept of heavenly mandate, which still works in China, where a ruler, a Chinese emperor, nowadays the general secretary of the Communist Party, is someone who is supposed to harmonize the heaven and the earth. And those rulers were successful who the people believed managed to harmonize, the heaven and the earth. So this is also a Chinese concept, and it is also very much a Greco-Roman concept, and then it continued to be a Byzantine concept and so forth. And it works even now. We will see this in a short time. So when the rulers, say in the Roman Empire, failed to secure this harmony between Pax Deorum and Pax Romana, their rule was challenged. There were often rebellions against them, either from the people, from the mobs in the streets, or from army, or from the aristocracy, from the Senate. Leaders could be killed, murdered, and this certainly was a result of the deficit of legitimacy for them. So the lack of harmony between Pax Deorum and Pax Romana led to the lack of legitimacy and eventually to a political crisis. And religion, as we said, played a very important role in securing legitimacy for the political leaders. Either or political bodies, either they were collective, like in the case of the Roman Republic, or individual, like in the case of the Roman Empire. It should be said that the entire period of antiquity and Middle Ages up to the modernity, religion was empowered by the fact that it constituted an inseparable and often even indistinguishable part of politics. Really, when we think about politics and religion in antiquity, so for instance, or in the Middle Ages, sometimes we extrapolate our modern concepts of the separation between politics and religion to the past, to the pre-modern time, which is a methodological mistake, because the people in antiquity and Middle Ages did not even suspect that such a separation is possible. They took it for granted that religion and politics are always intertwined to the extent that they constitute one single entity. I call it a theopolitical entity. That's what the converted Christian empire became, the Byzantium, the so-called Byzantium became this theopolitical entity. And that's what the Greco-Roman states used to be. They were always combining together closely religion and politics without any separation between them. As a result of this mingling together, mixing up together religion and politics, religious leaders often claim for themselves political authority, and political leaders claim the same claim that their rule is approved by the divine, or even identify themselves with the divine. In the Roman Empire, an emperor were also the highest priest, Pontifex Maximus, the title that was transferred to the bishops of Rome, as we know. Moreover, emperors were deified. Either they were alive or after their death. Initially, their deification, they used also the Greek word apotheosis, which is very similar to the modern patristic term of theosis, divinization. Well, in the Greco-Roman world, they had apotheosis, when the political rulers, some political rulers were elevated, were considered to be deities. This apotheosis applied originally only to some individuals, such as, for instance, Julius Caesar or Octavian, who became known as Augustus. And Augustus, I should remind you, is a religious term. It applied first to gods. In Greek, it literally means it's a Latin calque from the Greek Sevastos, the word which applied to gods. And Octavian, Emperor Octavian, who succeeded Julius Caesar, was the first emperor who was called Augustus, and thus he appropriated this divine title for himself. And also later, the entire institute of leadership in the Roman Empire became divine. And this idea of apotheosis applied not just to individuals, but to the institution. As we know, this became a reason of the persecutions against Christians, because the Christians were demanded to respect this divine institution of imperial power and to worship it, and they refused, and therefore they were persecuted. I'm talking about this in order to demonstrate that those features of the political power, like apotheosis, like the status of Pontifex Maximus for the Roman emperors, like the deification of the Roman institution, all of them were designed to boost the legitimacy of the imperial authority. So legitimacy of the emperor stemmed from their divine status in the pre-Christian Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire became Christian, these capacities were reinvented by the Christian political theology and by the Christian political theologians, people like Eusebius of Caesarea. Some individual emperors, such as Constantine or Theodosius or Justinian, they became canonized as saints, which was kind of very similar in a sense, at least formally, to the status of Augusti in the Roman Empire before the Christian era. Besides this, any emperor, starting with Constantine, was regarded as the image of God, imago Dei. It's interesting that only once in a panagoge of, which is ascribed to Photius, Patriarch Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, was for the first time proclaimed as imago Dei, image of God. Before that, only the emperors claimed this status for themselves, to be the image of God. I would also argue that being the image of the only God for the Christian emperors boosted their legitimacy and imperial power. They boosted it more than what the pagan emperors enjoyed. Well, even though the pagan emperors were regarded gods, they were just one of many gods in the Roman pantheon. But the Roman emperor was the only image of the only God, which gave the emperors exclusivity in comparison with the Roman emperors. So I think that after the conversion of Christianity, the divine status of the emperors was not diminished, but on the contrary, it increased. Now, after this brief survey of the idea of legitimacy in antiquity and in the including the Christian antiquity, let us go to the idea of sharing power, this concept. This idea of sharing power was pertinent to the Greco-Roman statehood, as well as the idea of legitimacy. It was embedded in the idea of first the Greek and then the Roman state. As we know from the history of the Roman state, its important part of the statehood was always featured power sharing. It constituted the core of the Roman Republic, which had been copied from the Athenian democracy. In the Republic, the main political institution was the Senate, which each year elected 2 consuls with executive mandate. When the Republican model of power sharing faced and caused a series of crises, like civil wars in the Roman Empire, it was gradually replaced with the monarchical model known as the Roman Empire. Still, this imperial model did not give an absolute power to the monarch, the emperor. It rather redistributed power within the system of power sharing in the Roman Empire. Roman Empire indeed was more a monarchy and less an oligarchy, with the emperors often exercising populism, overcoming the senatorial heads above their heads. The Senate and other republican institutions, such as Curia, continued playing an important role in the system of power sharing in the Roman world. Towards the end of the 3rd century, the power in the empire was redistributed again with the ascension to power of a soldier, a general from what is now Yugoslavia, Diocletian, who introduced the system of tetrarchy. And he essentially shared his sole power with 3 other guys. Well, it's quite curious that those who shared with him power, and tetrarchy included 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars, all of them were from what is now Yugoslavia, what used to be until recently Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, all of them. So this redistribution of power happened with a significant Balkan input. One of them, those guys who participated in the tetrarchy, who was the son of the first Caesar in the tetrarchy, Constantine, who, by the way, was born in what is now Serbia, Niš, he continued this work of reshaping the system of distribution of power. He continued redistributing the power, the process which was launched by Diocletian. And that is my point, that Constantine just continued the process which started before him, but he continued it in a very innovative, very unusual way for the Roman Empire. In this system, he canceled tetrarchy. He assumed the entire power in his own hands. He became the sole ruler of the empire again, but he found other ways of sharing power, right? Sharing power with other institutions. He did not share power with the Senate, something that one would expect from him, because the Senate was an old republican institution, and we take it as a given that Constantine remained as a monarch, but I think it was not a given. It was rather a surprise, because the republican traditions were very much alive in the Roman milieu, and many people wanted the restoration of the Senate and other republican institutions, and Constantine did not do that. Instead, he promoted a new institution in the system, in his system of power sharing, and this institution was the church. I believe that the church, for Constantine and for many of his contemporary politicians and ideologists, philosophers, political philosophers, was not just the church, not what the church was for the theologians. It was an institution, a political institution, which became a core, a keystone in a new system of power sharing with the Roman Empire. That's why this institution was endowed with many political privileges and economic privileges. They were exempted from taxation. They were given status to judge, to distribute wealth, and so forth. So they played a role that the role that the old republican institution had played in the Roman Republic and then Empire before the conversion to Christianity. So this is a kind of my new insight into the role of the church in the church-state relations after Constantine, that it was a republican institution, a new republican institution, and a key stone in the new system of power sharing in the Roman Empire. And this system of power sharing has been called and is known today as symphony. So essentially, symphony is not just about, the nice relations between the church and the state. No, it's a much more complicated and much more sophisticated system, a new system of power sharing in the Christian Empire. This model, symphonic model of power sharing, was implemented and became symbolized in the new imperial capital, Constantinople. In the new Rome, which Constantinople became, the role of the Senate was diminished even more than it was in the old Rome. Well, it was a kind of in ruins. The Senate was in ruins as an institution in the old Rome, but it was diminished to just to a symbol, to a council around the emperor. And it was very much weakened. Instead, the church, as I mentioned, became the new Senate, a key mechanism in the new model of power sharing. A symbol of this new model became the famous Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, the cathedral, which, well, think about the idea of a basilica, because Hagia Sophia is a basilica. By the way, in the morning today is a crazy day. In the morning today, I participated in another conference organized in California with people from Stanford, from Berkeley, and we discussed the conversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque recently. Well, we started our conference at 5 a.m. my time. It was a crazy time. So it was an interesting discussion how symbolic was Hagia Sophia and continues to be even for modern Turkey. That's why Erdogan, undertook the conversion of the museum to the mosque again. Even more symbolic was the role of this cathedral basilica in the Byzantine Empire. Originally, basilica was not a church, was not a temple, was not a religious edifice. A basilica was an office building, a building with that hosted administration, local administration, tax collectors, different offices, local, municipal, and imperial. Sometimes I explain to my American students that a basilica was like a federal building in major, in the states and major cities in the United States, where the federal governmental agencies are located, are hosted. So essentially, basilica was an administrative building, and the basilicas turned into churches. This, I think, is an important, a symbolic process of turning an administrative building, an imperial building, to a church building, which exactly was a symbolic act of endowing the church with political capacities, with republican capacities even. And St. Sophia became such a symbol as a basilica and as the main church of the Byzantine church. And as we all know, the idea of symphony, the idea of this interconnectedness between the church and the state is best articulated in the famous preamble to Novella 6 by Justinian, by the Emperor Justinian, who also built St. Sophia, as we know it now. And let me quote this part of this Novella 6. "The greatest gifts that God, in his celestial benevolence, has bestowed on mankind are priesthood and sovereignty. the one serving on matters divine and the other ruling over human affairs and caring for them. Each proceeds from one and the same authority and regulates human life. So we have two institutions here. One is expressed by the word priesthood, which is the church, which is a reference to the church, and another is a reference to the imperial power, which is expressed by the word sovereignty. The idea of symphony, well, the original Latin text called it consonantia, which literally means symphonia in Greek. Is very similar again to the idea that I mentioned earlier, the idea of harmony between earth and heaven, the idea which is embedded in the Chinese political culture primarily. And it's about this idea has to do with the heavenly mandate. So the guy, the person who was in charge in securing this symphony was the emperor. The guy who was endowed with the divine mandate, heavenly mandate, and could lose it easily if he makes mistakes, was the Byzantine emperor. He was the guy who essentially managed the republican institutions in Rome and the church as a republican institution. So it was not about just, you know, a partnership. Well, a partnership was an ideal in the Byzantine symphony, but the reality was that the emperor was the manager of the symphony. And this symphony was also a source of legitimacy for him. So if he managed it well to secure peace in the church and in his empire, then his legitimacy was boosted, this one, political legitimacy. It depended on symphony. So the symphony, on the one hand, was a system of power sharing. On the other hand, it was a source of political legitimacy for the imperial power. Symphony was an upgrade of the old Roman Pax Deorum. Now it was Pax Christi, the peace of Christ, that the emperor had to translate into Pax Romana, a new Pax Romana, the Byzantine one. Also, it should be mentioned that the political model of power sharing and legitimacy became the basis for the Byzantine ecumenism and international relations. I'll explain you why. Usually when we talk about ecumenism, we don't think about Byzantium, because for us, ecumenism is a modern phenomenon. It emerged in the beginning of the 20th century with the famous Edinburgh conference in 1910, and the ecumenical movement is perceived usually as a modern movement in the 20th century. But I argue that in Byzantium, in the Christian Roman Empire, ecumenism flourished, and it shaped to a great extent the both political and ecclesial developments. The empire cared about the preservation of the church's unity in the case, for instance, of the Arian, Donatist, Chalcedonian, and other crises. We know that those crises were overcome largely with the participation of the Roman Empire. One of the strongest motivations for the emperors to participate in these ecumenical projects was to preserve the system of power sharing. That is my suggestion. It was crucial for the church that the church, as a partner in the system of power sharing, preserves integrity and does not split to schisms. If the church is divided into different groups, then it ceases to be a reliable partner in the power sharing. And also, it decreases its possibility of providing legitimacy for the imperial power. So for the empire, it was crucial that the church stays one, and the church gets not get divided. And that's why the empire made everything possible to prevent schisms, sometimes quite violently, sometimes with the violation of the internal regulations and the internal norms of the church. Some theological norms, as we know them now, like the Neo-Chalcedonian Christology, was enforced politically, and it was a politically motivated ecumenical project, Neo-Chalcedonianism, promoted by the Emperor Justinian, whom we mentioned earlier. So the system of power sharing and dependence on legitimacy stemming from the church encouraged the state to enforce ecumenism in Byzantium. Also, the system of power sharing affected the missionary activities of the church. While in the partnership with the empire, the Byzantine church mostly did not pursue mission, and it is one of the paradoxes of Byzantium. Even though Byzantium was huge, it was, well, in the words of Virgil, who uttered these words in the time of Julius Caesar, the Roman Empire is the empire without ends. So that was the idea behind the Byzantine Empire. It was supposed to be the empire without ends, universal, and yet the church did not develop any significant activity beyond the Byzantine world. Quite in striking contrast to the churches, like for instance the Church of the East that ended up in the Persian Empire, the neighbor of Byzantium. And in the Persian Empire, the Church of the East developed a remarkable missionary activity. It reached China, India, it covered the entire Asia. That was an extraordinary missionary activity which came from the church, which was not empowered by the state. And that is my point, that the partnership, the system of power sharing in Byzantium between the church and the state affected the missionary activities of the church. It actually disabled the church. It prevented the church from going much beyond the empire. Unlike the Church of the East in the Persian Empire, which was not bound by the system of power sharing with any empire. It just went and disseminated Christianity as far as in China. Probably the only remarkable exception from this Byzantine inability to promote Christianity was the mission among the Slavs. But again, this mission among the Slavs was very much politically motivated. Byzantium wanted to extend its influence on the client states in among the Slavs, and they used the church as an instrument of enhancing their political influence. So essentially, the mission among the Slavs was also a part of the system of power sharing and legitimacy for the Byzantine world. There were also crises in this system, such as the one during the iconoclasm. The iconoclastic state tried to strip the church of both roles as a partner in the power sharing system and as a partner in legitimacy, as a provider of legitimacy. When Emperor Leo III declared that he was both the king and the priest, he essentially effectively usurped the legitimizing capacity of the church. So that political legitimacy came from the church to the state, and the state became a self-legitimizing entity. And the state claimed this power to legitimize itself through pursuing its own religious policies. Like, for instance, cancellation of icons. This was a policy that affected both popular piety and the theological standing of the church. It was a challenge for both the people and for the church, and it was an attempt to usurp this legitimizing source. It was also a blow to the system of power sharing for the church. The church was excluded by the iconoclasts from the system of power sharing. It's quite interesting that other even rudimentary institutions of republic, of the Roman Republic, like the Senate, Byzantine Senate, was also excluded from the power sharing. It was not a prominent partner in the power sharing, I mean the Senate. But even in its very small role, that small role was taken from it. And there was another novella by Emperor Leo VI, novella 47, that stripped the Senate of any remaining power that it had. So it was an interesting process when the state, under the iconoclasts, essentially usurped both the legitimizing power of the church and the power sharing participation from the church and from the Senate. And of course, as we know, that such monopolization of power and the sources of for its legitimacy led to a profound political crisis. This crisis was overcome with an active contribution from the church. The church acted as an institution that restored the power sharing balance in the post-iconoclast Byzantium. Such figures as Saint Theodore of Studium, a famous monk, and Patriarch Photius later on, they became major players in the restoration of the system of power sharing. And I should remember that Theodore of Studium came from a prominent aristocratic family in Byzantium. Patriarch Photius was himself an official. They represented somehow the republican institutions in Byzantium, and they acted through the church in order to restore the system of power sharing in Byzantium. In the meantime, large parts of the church found themselves in a completely different situation as a result of the Christological controversies in the 5th century and the rise of Islam in the beginning of the 7th century, from the beginning of the 7th century. The Church of the East, which I've mentioned, and the Oriental churches departed from the Byzantine Church as a result of the controversies in the 5th century. They found themselves in a completely different kind of symphonic relations, first with the Persian Empire and later with the Arab Caliphate. This kind of symphony that they had, and I believe that the Church of the East and the Oriental churches, all the non-Chalcedonian churches, they had a kind of symphony with the caliphs and earlier with the Persian shahs. In this symphony, however, the church did not anymore enhance the legitimacy of its political partner, because neither caliphs nor shahs did not need the church to boost their legitimacy. They didn't also want to share power with the church. So the church found itself in a situation when there was no power sharing and no need for their services for political legitimacy. This model was slightly changed in the Ottoman Empire. The millet system in the Ottoman Empire restored the power sharing for the church. Within 3 millets, Rum, Armenian, and Assyrian, their respective heads, the patriarchs, enjoyed a lot of political power. The Byzantine Patriarch of Constantinople, as a matter of fact, received from the Muslim sultans more authority than they had from the Byzantine Basilevses. While some aspects of power sharing became even stronger for the church, and indeed so, because the patriarchs became the heads, the ethnarchs, the heads of the millets, they received the responsibility for farming taxes, they judged the kind of people from their millets and so forth, so they had more political power within their groups, within their millets than they had in Byzantium. Well, still, this system of power sharing was very much local and locked to the millets. And again, the sultans did not need the service of the church in boosting their legitimacy. So in the Ottoman situation, what we have a limited power sharing, localized power sharing, but in this locality, it was very strong in the millet, and no political legitimacy services requested from the church. This situation changed again in the modern national states that emerged mostly from the Ottoman, but also from the Habsburg empires in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And the balance of the powers in those national states like Greece, like Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, and so forth, it changed again. The church and the states played a key role in providing legitimacy for the new national governments. And essentially, the church was the main source of legitimacy for the governments that emerged out of the Ottoman and Habsburg empires. And they were not recognized for some time, and the church, and also they struggled to be recognized by their own people, and the church actually boosted the legitimacy of those national governments in the national states. And the most obvious example is the situation in modern Greece, where the church became the source of what we can call civil religion. Civil religion aims at providing legitimacy for political authorities on the basis of religious rituals, calendars, rhetoric, narratives, and so forth. And the Greek civil religion actually was the original one, the prototypical one for all other Orthodox civil religions. And the purpose of the civil religion in Greece was exactly to boost the power, the legitimacy of the government that emerged. First, the government of Capodistrias, and then the government of the monarchs after Otto, King Otto. And the Greek situation, the Greek state, set a prototype for a new model of power sharing and legitimacy for other Orthodox countries. So in Greece, we have a situation of very important political service of the church to provide political legitimacy, and again, almost no power sharing, because the national governments cut the churches from any decision making in the political sphere. The churches were instrumentalized and were dispowered politically. So in Greece, and later on in the countries like Bulgaria, Serbia, in Bulgaria, the church started the process of nation building and the creation of the national state. And then in Bulgaria, in Serbia, in Romania, we have a situation which is reversed to the situation in the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman Empire, remember, we said power sharing was quite strong. Political legitimacy was not needed from the church. In the national states that emerged from the Ottoman Empire, the political legitimacy was very important for the government, but power sharing was almost next to nothing. Something similar happened in the Russian Empire, where the church was also part of the civil religion, Russian civil religion, and also a source of legitimacy for the imperial power in the Romanov's empire. At the same time, after Peter the Great, the church was largely deprived of real power sharing. The church was excluded from the partnership, from the system of power sharing in the Russian Empire. And instead, it was not the church who participated in the power sharing, it was the state who absorbed the entire power, even within the church, through the position of the Ober Procuror of the Holy Synod, who was as an imperial official appointed by the Tsar to the Synod, and he was the main decision maker in the church. After the Bolshevik Revolution 1917, the Russian church was completely stripped of power sharing and the capacities of legitimization. Its services were not needed by the state at all, because the state had proclaimed itself an atheist, and atheism became, as it were, the official religion of the Soviet Union. However, it was not that simple all the time in the Soviet Union. After the World War II, the situation slightly changed. Excuse me. The Soviet state began using the church after the World War II in those areas where it wanted to improve its legitimacy, in the regions like the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. The Russian and other Slavic churches began playing some limited role in legitimizing the Soviet regime in those areas. The Russian church was used as an instrument of international politics of the Soviet Union in order to provide the Soviet interests in the Middle East, in the Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, and so forth. So a very limited legitimizing role of the church became a factor of international politics after the World War II. In the same period, after the World War II, the Russian Orthodox Church began aspiring for some kind of power sharing, not just legitimizing power. The Russian Church wanted some share in politics, in decision making. This was particularly the vision and the aspiration of a late Metropolitan Nikodim Rotov of Leningrad, who was a very important, a very powerful figure in the Russian Church in the after-war period. And his ideal was the church participating in power sharing with the state, even if the state is Soviet, is atheist. It's interesting, and here ecumenism comes to the scene, because Nikodim Rotov, Metropolitan Nikodim Rotov, used ecumenism as an instrument to gain some share in the political power. In this point, the interests of the Soviet state and of the church converged in promoting ecumenism, in encouraging the Orthodox churches, especially from the Eastern Bloc, to participate in the ecumenical movement, something that happened after the General Assembly of the World Council of Churches in New Delhi, as you know, in 1961. So after New Delhi, in 1961, the interest of the state to promote its political legitimacy through the ecumenical institutions like the World Council of Churches, and the interest of the church to have some power sharing through the same institutions like the World Council of Churches converged. And this contributed to the involvement of the churches from the Soviet bloc in the ecumenical movement. Well, the Soviet state got what it wanted. It increased its legitimacy through the World Council of Churches and other ecumenical organizations. So it reached its goal of political legitimacy. Not completely, probably, but still it had some gains from the ecumenical movement. The church, however, did not manage to get power sharing from the Soviet state through the ecumenical movement. Metropolitan Nikodim Rotov himself, he was not elected as a patriarch, as we know, and even though he was very much hopeful, and he died under very suspicious circumstances in Rome, and his project of making the church participating in the power sharing with the state failed, until essentially his disciple, then Metropolitan Kirill, and now the Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, came back with the same idea of getting for the church a share in the power system in post-Soviet Russia, and his instrument to get share for the church to participate in power sharing here was, for instance, the famous or infamous doctrine of the Russian world. This doctrine, on the one hand, was an instrument of legitimization for Mr. Putin as the president of Russia, especially after the infamous swap of power with Dmitry Medvedev in 2012. And it also became an instrument, the Russian world, of increasing participation of Russia, of the Russian church in power sharing with the state. That was, again, a convergence of the interests of the Russian state in boosting its political legitimacy and the interests of the Russian church in power sharing. Just like in New Delhi in 1961, this convergence of the interests between the church and the state helped the church to participate in the ecumenical movement. The convergence of the interests of the state and of the church through this project of the Russian world was supposed to serve the interests of both the church and the state. However, just like in the case with Nikodim Rotov, I believe the present situation with the Russian world was also a failure for the church. The state got what it wanted. It increased its legitimacy, the rates of approval of Mr. Putin in his office rocketed up to the skies as a result of his annexation of Crimea and the wars and in the east of Ukraine, and so forth, through this ideology of the Russian world. So he got what he wanted. He got an increased and boosted legitimacy, but the church did not get anything. The church still struggles to get some share in power sharing with the state and cannot get it. So I believe it is a failure for the church, as it used to be the failure for the church in the Soviet time under Metropolitan Nicodim Rotov. Let me touch briefly in the remaining time what happened in the Orthodox country outside the Soviet bloc during the Cold War period. There also we can consider the situation in the same terms of political legitimacy and power sharing. Well, more liberal governments outside the Soviet Union did not want the church to participate in the power sharing. And they did not need the church to provide their legitimizing power to the state. However, in contrast to them, conservative governments, especially dictatorships that came to power in several Orthodox countries like Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, and so forth, they desperately needed the legitimizing power of the church. Because they were dictatorships, they did not come to power in legal ways, through legal instruments. They usurped power, and they needed an extra legal sources of legitimacy, and the church provided them with those sources of legitimacy. However, and this is an interesting surprise, the dictatorship did not want to share in power with the church. They wanted the church to provide them with legitimacy, but they did not want to give power, to share power with the church. And we see this in the case, for instance, of the dictatorship of the so-called black colonels in Greece from 1967 to 1974, when the church supported completely the dictators, the colonels, the dictatorship, but the dictators did not support the church. Moreover, they purged the synod of the Greek church of those hierarchs, members of the synod, who were against the dictators. They forced the archbishop of Athens to step down, and they instead appointed the archbishop who supported them, Hieronymus Katsonis, and they created their own synod, which was uncanonical. So it was a kind of a very clear violation of the internal regulations of the church, with which the dictatorship paid to the church for providing, for the church providing the dictatorship with legitimizing power. It was certainly a violation. Probably the only exception when a dictatorship decided to share some power with the church was the case of the Romanian Patriarch Miron, who, under the dictatorship of King Cyril, was appointed for a very short period of time, for just more than a year, the Prime Minister of Romania. But it was a very short period, and it was rather an exception from this rule. Now let me conclude my presentation with ecumenism in the post-Soviet era. I mentioned earlier that many churches, Orthodox churches, especially from the Soviet bloc, participated in the ecumenical movement because they wanted to survive, first of all, in the Soviet situation. And for some churches, it was really a strategy of survival. And some wanted also to get a piece of pie of power with the state. After the Soviet Union collapsed and the Soviet system collapsed as well, after 1991, this situation changed for the churches. They didn't see anymore the ecumenical movement as an instrument of survival for themselves, or an instrument of sharing power with the state. That's why they essentially, some of them, they just dropped or they just decreased their participation in the ecumenical movement. It means that their participation in the ecumenical movement in the first place was not quite sincere. It served those two kind of reasons, those two rationales, but did not serve the rationale of true, sincere ecumenism. And after those two rationales went away, there was no reason for many of them to participate in the ecumenical movement. And that is the reason, I believe, of the ecumenical winter, as it is called, ecumenical fatigue, that the Orthodox churches retrieve themselves from the ecumenical activities. They don't support it sincerely. Sometimes they even withdraw from the ecumenical organizations like the World Council of Churches. And I believe that this ecumenical fatigue has to do, again, with those two factors. Well, in order to invigorate the ecumenical participation of the Orthodox churches, I think these two factors, need to be overcome, need to be put aside, and more sincere, more straightforward ecumenical interest should replace those two factors: political legitimacy and power sharing. So that is my very, of course, I know it's very everything, you know, very broad, very galloping overview of the situation. This is a new idea that I'd like to share with you to consider. Well, the church-state relations, ecumenical relations, political roles that the church played in the terms of, in those two terms, political legitimacy and sharing power.
So, thank you, Professor Havaroon. Had to fix some technical issues just before. We have some time left to have some questions for Professor Havaroon, and you do it by using the chat, and I will pick up the questions from you. So use the chat and send it to everyone, and we'll pick up the questions for Professor Havaroon. So please, if you have questions, place them in the chat now. So, Professor, what kind of church-state relationship do we need in our present time?
Okay, good. Yeah, there was an issue, I think, a technical issue. We were kicked off out of the session. So yes, I believe that the church-state relations, first of all, should abandon this scheme of political legitimacy and power sharing. It's not the business of the church to participate in power sharing with the state. And it is not the business of the church to provide legitimacy for political rulers, especially, you know, really bad guys, dictators and others, something that the church does still. So I think the framework, the general framework for the church-state relations nowadays should be the idea of the separation, the wall between the church and the state, on the one hand. On the other hand, it should be partnership. Partnership requires equality between the partners. In the partnership, you do not mingle together. You do not constitute one thing, as it is the idea of symphony. Symphony is different. The Byzantine symphony is different from the idea of partnership. In the partnership, there are two very different entities, the church and the state, and they respect each other. They have each entity has its own interest and respects the interests of the other partner. They work together, but they don't serve the interests of each other, either through power sharing or through, you know, providing legitimizing services. That would be my very brief answer to that. Michael, you are muted.
Now you hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have several questions, but all the questions relate to this, or the latest question relate to the axis of power sharing and political legitimacy, and how would the present Orthodox hierarchs and episcopacy deal with this, both in terms of regarding the church and state, but also internally, among the churches themselves. If you use these two, then maybe you should use also ecclesial legitimacy as kind of concept.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And if you see, look at the latest crisis in the Orthodox Church, like the break of communion between the Ecumenical Moscow Patriarchate and the Ecumenical Patriarchate, because the Ecumenical Patriarchate did not break communion with Moscow Patriarchate. The other way around happened. You can explain this crisis also in the terms of power sharing and legitimacy, providing legitimacy, because. Say the reason was the Ukrainian church, apparently, as we all know, and the granting Kotosefa to the Ukrainian church certainly delegitimized to a great extent the Kremlin. It was a blow to the Kremlin, and it was a blow to the legitimacy of a political power, and it also endangered the power sharing between the church and the state. So what the Russian Church, I think, did by breaking communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, it tried essentially, effectively, to save legitimacy of the Kremlin and wanted to increase its own power sharing with the Kremlin through this step. So I think the motivation was driven for breaking communion. The motivation was driven by those two factors, power sharing and legitimacy.
So what would be the benefit for the present Moscow Patriarchate to continue with its affairs in the World Council of Churches and ecumenism and inter-Christian relations?
Yes, for instance, if you see why the Moscow Patriarchate and other churches, not just the Moscow Patriarchate, have frozen their relations with the ecumenical organizations and essentially reduced their participation in the ecumenical movement to formalities, then you see that, one of the reasons is the increase of conservatism in the churches. This conservatism is an ideology, and this ideology is political. Therefore, when the church listens to the conservatives, to the fundamentalists, they essentially play a political game. And by playing this political game, they decrease their participation in the ecumenical movement. Therefore, in order to kind of come back to the ecumenical tracks, the churches need to get rid of these political games by appeasing either conservatives or liberals or whatever, any political ideology, and they probably have to stop looking at the state, what the state wants from them. Because I think ecumenism is the genuine interest of the churches, and ecumenism. It happened that in our time, in the time of the ecumenical fatigue, as I mentioned, ecumenism goes against both the legitimizing power of the church and the interest of the church in power sharing. Therefore, the church has to kind of abandon that dilemma of power sharing and legitimization and go to the genuine interest, which is an ecumenism. So,
going back to the present Eastern Christian world, how would you interpret the situation with Cyprus, using your two axes? And would it be a positive examples of a partnership between church and state, or are there any positive partnerships?
That's an excellent illustration of what I've said. Because in Cyprus, under the Archbishop Macarius III, as you know, he was also the prime minister, the head of the state. I think he was president, not prime minister, president of Cyprus. And in his person, we had an ideal situation of power sharing between the church and the state. It was rather the church that shared the power with the state in the case of Macarius. And what happened? The invasion of Turkey to Cyprus happened. It led to a major crisis when Cyprus lost almost half of its territory. So it didn't work well for Cyprus.
So that's not a positive example. Are there any positive examples of a kind of partnership between the church and the...
Well, in the recent time, in the modern time, I don't have any positive example. Maybe you know better, but I can't recall any.
What would be the conclusion from you concerning this?
Well, it's exactly what I said in the end, that it's better to avoid this dilemma of power sharing with the state and legitimizing services of the church. It's much better to embark on a different model, non-Byzantine model, non-symphonic model of partnership between the church and the state under the conditions of the separation between the church and the state.
So how would you interpret the relationship of diaspora churches, for example, in the Nordic countries with the state then?
Yes, I think you are spared of this dilemma. I mean, the Orthodox minorities, Oriental Eastern Christian minorities in the Nordic country, it's largely the problem of the established churches, like the Church of Sweden, for instance, or the Church of Norway, or, well, in Finland it's a bit different, where there are two established churches, the Lutheran Church and the Orthodox Church. But I think they de facto, in fact, what they have is a model of separation, model of partnership that I'm talking about.
Are there any more questions that should be placed here now? Then I would place my own question here, and that concerns your vision of a strong ecumenical activity within the Roman Empire, and the use of this for sake of a Roman state, so to say. What would be the benefits from the side of a state today, and or are there any benefits, especially in the diaspora where they have several cultures and so on? What could be the benefit, or do you have an example except from the ex-communist countries?
Yeah, I think it's much better if the state stays away from the ecumenical undertakings of the church, because if the state begins intertwining in the ecumenical relations of the church, then later or sooner it will make harm. It will do harm to the church. I think the churches need to decide themselves what they want ecumenically, and they need to themselves to pursue an ecumenical agenda, not with the being persuaded by the state in pursuing the ecumenical agendas. Well, the state, in the framework of a partnership, if there is a partnership, the state may help the church to pursue its own agendas, ecumenical agendas, like maybe by providing, I don't know, funds through grants or whatever. But there should not be any direct policy making for the church on behalf of the state in pursuing ecumenism.
So then we're back in the influence on the church from this political legitimacy and the power sharing axis. Has it affected how the church fathers have approached their own theological formulations and biblical hermeneutical approaches, as an example?
Well, yes, and it's interesting that some theological disciplines have flourished under the condition of the separation between the church and the state. If you take ecclesiology, for instance, the newest theological discipline, there was no ecclesiology, in the time of in Byzantium, in the times of the symphony between the church and the state. Ecclesiology emerged only after or when the church began separating from the state, at least in the Christian East. And ecclesiology as such was not very much encouraged. If you take, for instance, the case of Khomyakov, Alexei Khomyakov, the father of the Orthodox ecclesiology, who lived in the middle of the 19th century, well, he wrote under the conditions of the Russian Empire, but he was not endorsed by the empire. The empire considered him a dissident and the opposite, kind of the position, even the political opposition to the policies of the Russian Empire. So ecclesiology emerged on the verge of the separation between the church and the state, and continued. Why we are talking about the 20th century as the century of ecclesiology, because the 20th century was also the century of the separation between the church and the state. So ecclesiology was born out of this separation, and many other theological reflections flourished because the church eventually became free from the state and could develop its own free thinking theological thinking, and that's exactly an example of how beneficial for the church is this kind of separation.
We have many Oriental listeners here, or viewers, if I would be more correct. I know that you have visited both Ethiopia and Egypt. How would you see the modern relationship between the Coptic Church and the state from this axis, and the historical background of Ethiopian Church?
Yeah, it's a very good question. They are different situations, even though they used to be one church until the middle of the 20th century, but they are different. They have very different models of the church-state relations. I should mention also the Armenian situation. As I said in the beginning, Armenia provided the prototype of the symphony between the church and the state. That was the earliest people who had their state and church coming together as a single theopolitical entity. Only later, Constantine converted to Christianity and started converting the Roman Empire into Christianity. So essentially, it happened. The model was emerged in the family of the Oriental churches, and with the Christological crisis in the 5th century, as we know, the Coptic Church decided to stay away from Byzantium. While the Coptic Church was really persecuted by Byzantium, there were a lot of martyrs, a lot of people who suffered and died because of the Byzantine policies, and that was kind of a shame of Byzantium. They eventually opted to stay with the Caliphate, with the Muslim rulers, and this created a culture of survival in a non-Christian state. They couldn't develop any symphony of the Byzantine time with the caliphs or with later on in the Ottoman Empire, when the caliphates became the part of the Ottoman Empire. So they learned to live separately from the state, and it is a very valuable experience, I believe. The Ethiopian experience is different. For the first time, Ethiopia experienced some kind of separation from the state only in the 70s under Mengistu Haile Mariam, under the Derg regime, which violently separated the church from the state. And that, I think, well, it was a very painful experience for the Ethiopian church. At the same time, I believe it was also valuable. The Ethiopian church experienced for the first time to live in the situation of not being supported by the state, or even having a hostile state as its vis-a-vis.
So, would you? One question in the chat here concerns: would it be, you think, that churches that are or were non-state churches would be more open to ecumenical cooperations than the state churches?
Yeah, that's exactly my point. That's exactly my point. Yes, that under the present circumstances, the churches which are separated from the state, but are in partnership with the state, are more ecumenically minded, open to ecumenism, or can be more open to ecumenism than the churches in the partnership with the state. That is probably not the common rule, but it happens more frequently. Yes. Again, the case of Byzantium contradicts this statement, because, as I mentioned, Byzantium, the emperors promoted ecumenism within the Byzantine Empire, and it was a very helpful service, a very good outcome of the symphony, I would say, because without the symphony, we would probably have had the schism as early as during Arianism. Not in the 5th century, but in the 4th century, the schism would have happened. And it was prevented solely by the effort of the state. Also, after the schism happened in the 5th century, the state did everything possible, sometimes impossible, to calm down the quarrels and to bridge the gaps that were created by the churches.
Would it also be that Orthodox state churches have a more difficult position in the diaspora to bridge the culture gap between the native landscape of Christianity and their own efforts, so to say?
Maybe. Well, the church in diasporas certainly face their own problems, and sometimes those problems are really difficult. They don't have the problem of the established churches, which still enjoy the partnership with the state. There are, as I said, there are problems that stem from this partnership, and the churches in the diaspora, they are spared of these problems, but they have their own problems. Exactly, the problem is exactly how to accommodate the diversity in which they live in the diaspora. It's a challenge, but if they manage to accommodate the diversity, they really get benefited. They really enrich themselves.
So the final question, and then I will just announce the next faculty lecture, would be, and that comes from Oriental side. What needs to be done to revive the inter-Orthodox dialogue and the healing of a schism of Chalcedon? And this has to be a short answer. So.
Yeah. Well, it cannot be a short answer, but I'll try. Well, we've agreed that there are no theological differences between us. That is the result of the dialogue. But it didn't lead us to the restoration of communion. And I believe that the reason why we are not in communion still are mostly cultural, because theology does not play anymore any role in the relations between the churches. Well, at least plays a very limited role. Cultural differences play much more significant role than the theology does. Therefore, I think to restore union, we need to go back to theology. We need to value again theology, to make theology working again, and to, as theology used to separate us, had separated us in the past, theology can reunite us nowadays, because what keeps us away from each other is not theology anymore. It's cultural differences and identities sometimes that we cherish.
That was a good final word. We have to return to theology. That's the end of your lecture and presentation of international relations and ecumenism. In 2 weeks from now, we have a second faculty lecture, October the 15th, same time, 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. And then it's Professor Davor Chalto who presents the field of religion, art, and democracy. And you will have access to this information on sanctdonatus.org or eos.se. You're most welcome back in 2 weeks to listen to Professor Chalto. So thank you for listening, and hope all were happy to listen to Professor Havaroon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me with you.